Fire her before she even unpacks, the CO said coldly, not even looking up, and for a moment, the entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. The girl standing in the doorway did not move. Outside, the late afternoon sky stretched gray over the hills of Westchester, the kind of quiet that made even footsteps feel too loud. Inside the Blackwood estate, silence was a rule, not a comfort. Emily Hayes stood there with a small duffel bag in her hand, her fingers slightly red from the cold, her shoes damp from the long bus ride that had taken nearly 2 hours from the edge of the city. She had been warned before she arrived. 16 maids had come and gone in less than a year. Some lasted a week. Most did not make it past 3 days. One had quit before finishing her first shift. The reason was always the same. Adrian Wolfe, 34 years old, billionaire, and, according to everyone who had ever worked under his roof, completely impossible to survive. The head housekeeper shifted uncomfortably beside her, whispering under her breath, "You can still walk away. No one would blame you." Emily did not answer. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the man at the far end of the marble hallway. He stood near a wall of glass that overlooked acres of perfectly trimmed land, dressed in a dark suit, as if even his own home was just another boardroom. He did not turn, did not acknowledge her, as if she were already gone. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow is a story you cannot miss. Emily tightened her grip on the bag. She thought of the hospital bill folded carefully in her coat pocket. Thought of her mother lying in a narrow bed under fluorescent lights, trying to smile through the pain. Walking away had never been an option. "I will stay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight pressing against her chest. The housekeeper looked at her with something between pity and disbelief. Then the sound of footsteps echoed sharply against the marble. Adrian Wolfe finally turned. His eyes were not angry, not loud, just empty. The kind of emptiness that made people feel smaller without a single word being spoken. He looked at Emily for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough to decide something, and then said if she breaks the rules, she is out by morning. No second chances. No exceptions. Emily met his gaze, not with defiance, but with something far more unsettling. Calm. In a house where everyone had learned to shrink, she did not. And for the first time in months, something unfamiliar flickered behind Adrian Wolfe's cold expression. Not warmth, not kindness, but a pause, as if somewhere deep beneath the silence, something had just been disturbed. The first night inside the Blackwood estate did not begin with instructions, it began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed against the walls and made every small movement feel like a mistake waiting to happen. Emily followed the housekeeper through a long corridor lined with dark wood panels and framed photographs that looked expensive but strangely lifeless. No family portraits, no laughter captured in time, just landscapes and abstract shapes that said nothing about the man who owned them. "This house does not forgive noise," the housekeeper said quietly as they walked. "Mr. Wolfe does not repeat himself, and he does not tolerate excuses. Meals are served at precise times. Floors must reflect light. Doors must close without a sound. If you're unsure, you do not guess. You ask me." Emily nodded once, absorbing every word, not out of fear, but out of focus. When they reached her room, it was smaller than she expected, tucked near the back staircase used by staff, but it was clean, warm, and more than she had allowed herself to hope for. After the housekeeper left, Emily set her bag down slowly and took out the folded hospital bill again. The number at the bottom felt heavier than the paper itself. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, and then tucked it away. Work first, everything else later. Downstairs, the kitchen was already prepared for dinner service, though there were no sounds of conversation, no clatter of dishes like in a normal home. Even the chef moved with controlled precision, as if the air itself had rules. Emily stepped carefully, watching, learning, memorizing. When the clock struck 7, dinner was placed on a long dining table that could seat 12, though only one chair was occupied. Adrian Wolfe sat at the far end, back straight, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on a tablet as if the meal in front of him was an afterthought. Emily stood near the wall, hands clasped lightly, waiting for any signal. None came. Minutes passed. The ticking of the clock grew louder. Finally, Adrian spoke without looking up. "The soup is too hot." The words were flat, controlled, but final. The chef stiffened. The housekeeper moved instantly, but Emily was closer. Without thinking, she stepped forward, lifted the bowl carefully, and paused just long enough to test the heat with a brief movement of her hand. Then she walked back to the kitchen, adjusted it, and returned within seconds, placing it back in front of him with quiet precision. Adrian's eyes lifted slightly this time. Not fully, just enough to register the change. He took a spoonful. No reaction, but he did not send it back. Dinner continued in silence. Course after course, each movement measured, each second stretching. At one point, a glass sat slightly off-center on the table. Adrian's gaze flickered toward it. Emily noticed before he spoke. She stepped forward and adjusted it by less than an inch. The moment passed. No words, but something subtle shifted in the air. Later that night, as the staff retreated to their quarters, the housekeeper stopped Emily near the stairs. "You should be careful," she said, her voice softer now. "He always starts like this. Quiet. Watching. Then he finds a reason. They all do something wrong eventually." Emily looked back toward the dark hallway that led to the main living area. The lights were dim now, shadows stretching across the polished floor. "Maybe," she said gently, or maybe no one ever stayed long enough to do something right. The housekeeper did not reply. Upstairs, behind a closed door, Adrian Wolfe stood alone in his study, the faint glow of the city lights spilling through the glass behind him. He had noticed, not the movements, not the precision, but the absence of fear. It lingered in his mind longer than it should have. And for reasons he could not explain, that bothered him more than any mistake ever had. Morning in the Blackwood estate arrived without sunlight. The heavy curtains in the main hall remained drawn, sealing the house in a dim, controlled stillness that felt untouched by time. Emily woke before the alarm she had set, her body still adjusting to the unfamiliar quiet. For a moment, she lay still, listening. No distant traffic, no voices, just the faint hum of the building itself, like it was holding its breath. She sat up slowly, her eyes falling to the folded paper on the small bedside table. The hospital bill. It had not changed. The number was still there, steady and unforgiving. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, soft but tired, telling her not to worry, telling her everything would be fine. Emily swallowed the thought and stood up. Worry would not change anything. Work might. Downstairs, the kitchen lights were already on, casting a warm glow that felt almost out of place in a house this cold. The chef nodded briefly as she entered, already moving between stations with practiced rhythm. No words were exchanged. There was no need. Everything here functioned on silent understanding or quiet correction. Emily moved to her assigned tasks, cleaning surfaces that were already spotless, aligning utensils that had likely been placed perfectly hours before. It was not about necessity. It was about control. As she worked, she began to notice the patterns. Every object had a position. Every routine had a precise time. Even the air felt scheduled. At exactly 8 o'clock, the housekeeper appeared beside her without warning. "Mr. Wolfe's study needs to be cleaned before he returns from his morning call," she said. "Do not touch anything on his desk. Do not open drawers. Do not move personal items." Emily nodded. Understood. The walk to the study felt longer than it had the night before. The door stood slightly ajar, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then she stepped inside. The room was larger than she expected, lined with shelves of books that looked untouched, a large desk positioned near the window, and a single chair placed with exact alignment. Everything was immaculate, and yet something about the space felt off. Not messy, not chaotic, just empty, as if it had been arranged by someone who no longer lived inside it. Emily began carefully, wiping surfaces, straightening edges that did not need straightening. She moved slowly, aware of every sound her movements created. Then she saw it. A single frame, placed near the corner of the desk, angled slightly away from view. It was the only personal object in the room. For a second, she paused. The housekeeper's warning echoed in her mind. Do not touch anything. Personal. But something about the way the frame had been turned, not hidden, but not seen, pulled at her curiosity. She did not pick it up. She simply adjusted her position, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass. A woman, smiling, warm eyes, standing beside a younger version of Adrian Wolfe. His expression in the photo was different. Not cold, not distant, alive. Emily felt something shift in her chest. Before she could think further, a voice cut through the silence. You're not supposed to be in here when I am. She turned instantly. Adrian stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room without effort. His gaze moved from her face to the desk, to the exact spot where her attention had been seconds before. I was instructed to clean before you returned, she said calmly. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then you were instructed incorrectly. The air tightened. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Adrian stepped inside, slow, deliberate, each step measured. Did you touch anything on my desk? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. Emily shook her head once. No. His gaze lingered on her, searching, as if expecting hesitation, fear, something to confirm what he already believed about people. But there was none, only quiet certainty. Adrian reached the desk, adjusted the frame by a fraction, returning it to the exact angle it had been before. You will not enter this room again without direct instruction from me, he said. Understood. Emily nodded. As she turned to leave, her eyes flickered once more toward the photo, then back to him. Not curiosity this time. Understanding. That was the first mistake. Not touching the desk, not entering the room, but seeing him, truly seeing him. And Adrian Wolfe, a man who had built his entire world on control, felt it immediately. Something in her silence was not obedience. It was awareness. And that was far more dangerous. The change did not happen all at once. It began with something so small that no one else in the house would have noticed. The next morning, for the first time since Emily arrived, the curtains in the east wing were slightly open. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough for a thin line of sunlight to slip through and touch the polished floor. Emily had done it quietly before anyone else. Came downstairs, her movements careful, almost respectful, as if she were not changing the house, only reminding it what light felt like. By the time Adrian entered the dining area, everything appeared the same at first glance. The table was set with perfect precision. The air still carried that controlled silence, and the staff stood exactly where they were expected to be. But something was different. He felt it before he saw it. His eyes shifted briefly toward the window. The light was wrong, or perhaps it was right, and that was the problem. He stopped walking for half a second, just long enough for the staff to notice the pause. Then he continued as if nothing had changed. Who opened the curtains? His voice was calm, but it cut through the room instantly. No one answered. The housekeeper lowered her gaze. The chef remained still. Emily stepped forward without hesitation. I did. The room tightened. Adrian turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto her with quiet intensity. You were not instructed to do that. No, I was not. Her voice remained steady, not defensive, not apologetic. Then why did you? Emily glanced briefly toward the window, the thin strip of sunlight now stretching slightly further across the floor. Because the room looked like it needed it. For a moment, there was no sound at all. Not even the faint ticking of the clock seemed to exist. Adrian studied her face, searching for something he understood. Fear, regret, calculation. But none of it was there. Just a simple answer that did not try to impress him or challenge him. It simply existed. That was new. Most people in this house either tried too hard or not at all. They either over-explained or avoided speaking completely. Emily had done neither. She had made a decision, a small one, and stood by it. Adrian walked past her without another word and took his seat at the table. The meal was served. Silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried a question now. Halfway through breakfast, Adrian set his fork down. Close them. The command was immediate. The housekeeper moved quickly, stepping toward the window. Emily did not move. The housekeeper hesitated, then continued, drawing the curtains back into their usual position. The light disappeared just as quietly as it had arrived. Adrian resumed eating. No. Reaction. No comment. But something had shifted. Later that afternoon, Emily was assigned to the main living room. It was one of the largest spaces in the house, designed more for display than for living. A grand piano sat untouched in the corner, its surface polished to a mirror shine, as if it existed only to be seen, never heard. Emily dusted the edges carefully, her reflection moving across the dark surface as she worked. Then she paused. Her fingers hovered just above the keys. She did not press them. Not yet. The silence in the room felt heavier here, like it had settled into the walls over time. Slowly, almost instinctively, she lowered her hand and pressed a single key. The sound was soft, barely more than a whisper, but in the stillness of the house, it echoed. Clear, alive, real. She let it fade before pressing another. A simple pattern, nothing complex, just enough to remind the room that it was capable of sound. Upstairs, in his study, Adrian froze. His hand stopped mid-motion over a document. The sound reached him faintly, but unmistakable. Music. His jaw tightened. No one played that piano. No one was allowed to. He stood up immediately, his chair sliding back with controlled force, and walked toward the door. Each step was sharper than the last. Downstairs, Emily did not hear him approach. She was focused on the keys, on the quiet rhythm forming under her fingertips, something steady, something human in a place that had forgotten what that felt like. The moment shattered when his voice cut through the room. Stop. The word landed like a blade. Emily's hands lifted instantly from the keys. The final note lingered in the air before fading into silence. Adrian stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but his presence charged with something far more dangerous than anger. You were not given permission to touch that. Emily turned slowly to face him. No, I was not. Then why did you? The question came again, sharper this time. Emily looked at the piano, then back at him. Because it is not meant to stay silent forever. The words settled between them, heavier than the sound that had just filled the room. And for the first time, Adrian Wolfe did not respond immediately. Because somewhere deep inside him, beneath the control, beneath the rules, beneath the silence he had built so carefully, something recognized the truth in what she had said. And that was exactly what he could not allow. The silence after the word stopped did not disappear. It settled into the room, heavier than before, as if the house itself had learned something it was not supposed to know. Emily stepped back from the piano slowly, her hands lowering to her sides, her expression unchanged. She did not apologize. She did not explain further. And that, more than the sound she had made, stayed with Adrian. Most people rushed to fix their mistakes around him. They filled the space with excuses, with nervous words, with anything that might soften his reaction. Emily did none of that. She simply stood there, as if the moment did not require defense. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Then he turned away without another word and walked out of the room, the echo of his footsteps sharp against the polished floor. The door closed behind him with quiet precision. The piano remained untouched, but something had already been disturbed. That evening, the house followed its usual routine, but the rhythm felt different. Emily moved through her tasks with the same calm focus. Yet now she understood the invisible lines more clearly. This was not just a house of rules. It was a house built to avoid feeling. Every object was controlled. Every sound was minimized. Every space was designed to keep something buried. And yet, without meaning to, she had already crossed that boundary. Later, as she prepared the upstairs hallway for the night, she noticed a small change. The study door was open. Not wide, just slightly as if it had not been fully closed. She paused for a moment, remembering his warning, then continued walking past without looking inside. She did not need to. She already knew what was in that room, or at least what was missing from it. Inside, Adrian stood near his desk, his eyes fixed on the city beyond the glass. The faint reflection of the room hovered over the skyline, merging the inside and outside into something blurred. His mind replayed the sound of the piano again and again. Not the notes themselves, but the intention behind them. Because it is not meant to stay silent forever. The words lingered, unwelcome. He had spent years ensuring that everything in his life remained exactly as it should be, predictable, controlled, untouched. And yet, in less than 2 days, she had opened a curtain, adjusted his routine, and played a sound in a room that had not heard music in years. It was not defiance. That would have been easier to handle. It was something else, something quieter, and far more dangerous. The next morning, Emily entered the kitchen earlier than usual. The house was still asleep, wrapped in its usual quiet, but the air felt slightly different, as if the walls were waiting. She moved to prepare the breakfast setup, aligning plates, checking temperatures, ensuring everything was ready before Adrian appeared. Then she paused. On the counter, beside the prepared dishes, was a cup of coffee. It was not part of the usual routine. The chef had not arrived yet. The housekeeper was not in the room. Emily stepped closer. The coffee was still warm, steam rising faintly in the dim light. She looked around, searching for an explanation, but there was none. Slowly, she picked up the cup and carried it to the dining table, placing it in the usual position at the far end. She did not question it. She simply adapted. Minutes later, Adrian entered the room. His steps slowed for a fraction of a second when he saw the coffee already waiting. His gaze shifted briefly toward Emily, then to the cup, then back again. He said nothing. He took his seat, reached for the cup, and paused. The smallest hesitation. Then he took a sip. The room remained silent, but something had changed. Not in the house, not in the routine, but in him. Because for the first time in a long time, something had been done for him without instruction, without expectation, and without fear. And he did not know what to do with that. The change did not show itself in obvious ways, and that was exactly why it unsettled Adrian Wolfe. Nothing in the house was out of place. The floors still reflected light with perfect clarity. The air still carried that controlled stillness. The staff still moved like shadows, careful and precise. And yet, something no longer followed the script he had built. It began with small disruptions that could not be corrected without acknowledging them. The curtains in the east wing were still being opened every morning. Not wide, never excessive, but enough to let the light exist. The piano remained untouched after that day, but the memory of sound lingered, as if the room itself remembered what it had been allowed to feel. And then there was the coffee. Every morning now, without instruction, it was there. Not early, not late, always at the exact moment he entered the dining room. The temperature was right. The taste was consistent. It was not perfect in the way the house demanded perfection. It was human. That was the problem. Adrian noticed everything. That was how he had built his empire. Nothing escaped his attention. And yet this was different, because it was not something he could correct with a command. It was not a mistake. It was intention. One evening, long after the staff had retreated and the house had returned to its quiet state, Adrian remained in his study, staring at a screen he was no longer reading. The city stretched out beyond the glass, distant and indifferent. His mind replayed the past few days with a precision that bordered on obsession. The curtain, the piano, the coffee, each moment small, each one controlled, and yet together, they formed something he could not define. Finally, he stood and walked out of the study, his steps slower than usual, less deliberate. The hallway lights were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. As he passed the staircase, he noticed a faint glow from the lower level. The kitchen. He paused. The house should have been silent by now. He moved toward the light, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Inside, Emily stood at the counter, her back to him, carefully placing something into a small container. She had changed out of her uniform, her movements softer now, less restrained. She did not hear him at first. Adrian remained in the doorway, watching. There was no performance in what she was doing. No audience. No expectation. Just quiet care. What are you doing? His voice broke the silence, controlled but sharper than before. Emily turned quickly, her eyes widening for a brief second before settling again. I did not realize you were still awake. That was not an answer. She glanced down at the container in her hands, then back at him. It is soup. He stepped further into the room, his gaze fixed on her. For who? For my mother. The words were simple, but they shifted something in the air immediately. Adrian's expression did not change, but his attention did. You leave the house to deliver food. Sometimes, after my shift ends. The answer was honest, without hesitation. He studied her for a moment, then asked, does she live far? About 40 minutes by bus. The distance landed differently this time. Not as information, but as effort. Adrian's eyes moved to the container, then back to her face. And you still arrive here before sunrise? Yes. Why? The question came out before he could stop it. Not as a command, as something else. Emily did not look away. Because she needs me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with something unspoken. Adrian turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the dark window above the sink. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, almost quietly, he spoke again. You will not be late tomorrow. It sounded like a command. It always did. But this time, it carried something unfamiliar beneath it. Not control, not anger, something closer to concern, though he would never call it that. Emily nodded once. I will not be. Adrian stood there for another second, as if waiting for something he could not name. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps fading into the silence of the house. Behind him, Emily remained still, the container still in her hands. She did not smile. She did not react. But something had changed. Not in the house. Not in the routine. In him. Because for the first time, Adrian Wolfe had asked a question that did not serve his control. It served his curiosity. And that was the beginning of something he had spent years trying to avoid. That night, Adrian did not return to his usual routine. He remained in his study long after the house had gone silent. But for once, he was not working. The screen in front of him glowed with unread messages, untouched reports, numbers waiting for decisions that would move entire markets by morning. Normally, that was where he lived. In control, in certainty, in results. But tonight, none of it held his attention. His mind was somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere far less predictable. The image came back to him without warning. Not the kitchen. Not the coffee. Not even Emily standing there with that steady calm. He could not break. It was the photograph. The one on his desk. The one he had turned away from the world. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Adrian reached toward it. His fingers paused just above the frame before finally lifting it. For a moment, he just stared. The woman in the picture was smiling in a way that no longer existed in his world. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, and the version of him standing beside her looked like someone he barely recognized. Younger, softer, unafraid. Her name surfaced in his mind like something he had tried to bury, but never truly could. Claire. The memory did not come gently. It never did. It arrived all at once. The hospital room. The quiet machines. The way her hand had felt colder each day. The way he had stood there, surrounded by the best doctors money could buy, and still could not change the outcome. He had promised her he would fix it. He had always fixed everything. But this time he had failed. The weight of that moment had never left him. It had simply transformed. Into silence. Into control. Into distance from anything that could be taken away again. Adrian set the frame down slowly, his jaw tightening. That was the reason. That was always the reason. Not arrogance. Not cruelty. Protection. If nothing mattered, nothing could hurt. If no one got close, no one could disappear. It had worked. Until now. His thoughts shifted again, this time pulling him back to the present. To Emily. To the way she had spoken about her mother. Because she needs me. The words echoed in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. He stood abruptly, as if the room itself had become too small, and walked toward the window. The city stretched endlessly below, lights flickering in patterns he had long ago stopped noticing. Somewhere out there, she was traveling back and forth every day, carrying food, carrying responsibility, carrying something he had spent years trying to avoid. Attachment. The next morning, the house resumed its rhythm, but Adrian did not. When he entered the dining room, the coffee was already there, as expected. But this time, his eyes shifted immediately to Emily. Not to correct, not to observe, to understand. She moved as she always did, quiet, precise, focused on her tasks. But now he saw more than her actions. He saw the effort behind them. The early mornings. The late nights. The reason she stayed when everyone else left. Halfway through breakfast, he set his cup down and spoke. "You said your mother is ill." The words broke the usual silence, catching the attention of everyone in the room. Emily looked up, slightly surprised but not shaken. "Yes." Adrian's gaze held steady. "What is her condition?" A brief pause. Then, she answered, "Chronic heart failure." The words were clinical, but the weight behind them was not. Adrian nodded once, processing, and the treatment. Ongoing. Expensive. The truth sat between them without decoration. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the edge of the table. He did not respond immediately. The staff remained still, unsure whether this was conversation or interrogation. Finally, he spoke again. "You take the bus every day." "Yes." "And you still manage your responsibilities here without error." Emily held his gaze. "I try to." Another pause. Then Adrian stood, his chair sliding back with quiet precision. The room straightened instinctively. As he walked past her, he stopped just for a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to hear the words he did not say out loud. This time, when he left the room, the silence he left behind was different. It was no longer empty. It carried something else, something that had not existed in this house for a very long time. Understanding. And for Adrian Wolf, that was the most dangerous shift of all. The shift did not go unnoticed by everyone in the house. Change never did. It moved quietly at first, like a draft through a sealed room, but eventually someone always felt it, and not everyone welcomed it. By the end of the week, whispers had begun to form beneath the surface of the staff. Nothing direct, nothing spoken in front of Emily, but enough to be felt in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the way eyes lingered just a second too long before turning away. The housekeeper, who had once watched her with quiet concern, now seemed more distant, her tone sharper, her instructions shorter. The chef avoided eye contact altogether. Something was shifting, and it was not only inside Adrian Wolf. That afternoon, Emily was called into the service office, a small room tucked behind the kitchen where schedules and records were kept. The housekeeper stood by the desk, a folder in her hands, her posture rigid. "Close the door," she said. Emily did as instructed, stepping inside and waiting calmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the housekeeper placed the folder on the desk and opened it. Inside were printed sheets, security logs, entry times, exit records. Emily's name appeared across several pages. "You have been leaving the property after hours," the housekeeper said, her voice controlled but no longer gentle. "Without authorization." Emily did not react with surprise. "Yes, I have." "You are aware that this violates protocol?" "Yes." "Then explain." The word was not a question. It was a demand. Emily met her gaze without hesitation. "I go to see my mother." The housekeeper's expression did not soften. "That is not relevant to your responsibilities here." "It is to me." The answer came quietly, but it landed with weight. The housekeeper closed the folder sharply. "This is not a place for personal priorities. This house runs on discipline, on structure, not on emotion." Emily did not look away. "I understand that." "Then you also understand that I can report this." "Have you dismissed immediately?" The silence stretched between them. The threat was real, the outcome predictable. This was how the house had always functioned. Rules broken, people removed, order restored. But Emily did not defend herself further. She did not argue. She simply nodded once. "If that is what you believe is necessary." The lack of resistance unsettled the housekeeper more than any excuse would have. "You did not even try to justify it." "I already did." The answer was calm, steady, and final. "Because she needs me." The same words, the same truth. And once again, they shifted something in the air. That evening, the report reached Adrian Wolf's desk. It was placed neatly among his documents. Another issue to be resolved, another decision to be made. He read it once, then again. His expression did not change, but his grip on the paper tightened slightly. Unauthorized exits, repeated violations, clear grounds for termination. That was the expectation. That was the pattern. That was what everyone in the house assumed would happen next. Adrian leaned back in his chair, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. His mind moved through the facts quickly, efficiently. The rules were clear. The consequences were established. There was no room for exceptions. And yet his thoughts did not stop there. They returned, uninvited, to the kitchen, to the quiet container in her hands, to the way she had answered without hesitation, to the effort that existed outside the walls of his control. Slowly, he set the report down on the desk. Not discarded, not approved, just placed aside. That alone was enough to break the pattern. The next morning, the house waited. The staff moved with an underlying tension, each person aware that something was about to happen. Emily entered the dining room as she always did, composed, focused, unchanged. She did not know the report had been filed. She did not know a decision had been expected. She only knew her responsibilities. Adrian entered moments later. His presence filled the room, sharper than usual. The air tightened instantly. He took his seat. The coffee was already there. The silence stretched. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. "You will not leave the house tonight." The words were direct, controlled, final. The staff exhaled internally. The pattern was returning. Order was being restored. Emily stood still for a moment. Then she answered, "I understand. No argument. No explanation. Just acceptance." Adrian's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the table. That was not the response he expected. It should have ended there. It always did. But something in him resisted the simplicity of it. His gaze lifted, meeting hers for a brief second. And in that moment, he saw it. Not defiance, not submission. Loss. Quiet, contained, but unmistakable. The kind of loss he knew too well. He looked away immediately, his expression hardening. Breakfast continued. The routine held. But the decision he had made did not feel like control. It felt like something else. Something heavier. Something that lingered long after the moment had passed. And for the first time, Adrian Wolfe began to question whether the rules he had built were protecting him or slowly breaking something he did not realize he still had. That night, the house felt colder than it had since Emily first arrived. Not because of the temperature, but because of what had been taken away. For the first time, she did not prepare the small container of soup in the kitchen. For the first time, she did not check the time against the last bus. Schedule. Instead, she remained in her room, sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, her hands resting still in her lap. The folded hospital bill lay beside her, but she did not pick it up. She already knew what it said. What she did not know was how her mother was feeling at that exact moment. Whether she had eaten, whether she had slept, whether she was alone. The uncertainty pressed against her chest, heavier than exhaustion, heavier than fear. Downstairs, the house moved through its routine as if nothing had changed. Dinner was prepared. The table was set. Adrian Wolfe took his place at the far end, just as he always did. The staff stood in their positions, silent, precise, invisible. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, something was missing. Adrian noticed it immediately. Not the absence of sound. Not the arrangement of the table. Something else. He could not name it, but he felt it. The air was different. Less grounded. Less alive. His gaze shifted briefly toward the doorway, almost unconsciously, as if expecting someone to enter. No one did. Dinner began. The first course was served. The second followed. Each movement executed perfectly. Each detail correct. But the rhythm was hollow. Halfway through the meal, Adrian set his fork down. The sound echoed louder than it should have. "Where is she?" The question cut through the room without warning. The housekeeper stepped forward immediately. "Miss Hayes is in her quarters, sir." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" A brief hesitation. "She complied with your instruction. She did not leave the house." The words landed with exact precision. Adrian leaned back slowly, his gaze fixed on the empty space across the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he stood abruptly, the chair moving back with controlled force. "Continue." His voice was flat, but something beneath it had shifted. He left the dining room without another word, his steps faster than usual, sharper. The hallway lights blurred slightly as he moved past them, his thoughts no longer aligned with his routine. He reached the back staircase and climbed without slowing. When he stopped outside Emily's door, he did not knock immediately. His hand hovered near the surface, as if the act itself required more thought than it should have. Then, finally, he knocked once. Inside, Emily looked up, startled by the sound. No one ever came here. She stood slowly and opened the door. Adrian stood there, his presence filling the narrow hallway in a way that made the space feel smaller. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his eyes moved past her, scanning the room briefly. No potbug, no propagation, just stillness. You did not go. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. You told me not to. Her answer was simple, direct, honest. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. That was not what he meant. Or perhaps it was. But hearing it now felt different. He looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for something he could define. Then he spoke again. Your mother. Does she expect you tonight? Emily hesitated for the first time. Yes. The word came softer now. Adrian nodded once, absorbing it. Then he turned slightly, as if about to leave. But he did not. Instead, he remained there, caught between two decisions that did not fit within the rules he had built for himself. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower than before. You will prepare the food. The words landed slowly, deliberately. Emily's eyes lifted, meeting his. And you will return before midnight. The condition followed immediately, controlled, precise. The hallway fell silent. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emily nodded once. Thank you. Adrian did not respond. He turned and walked away, his steps steady, but something inside him no longer was. Downstairs, the house remained unchanged. The routine continued. The staff moved as they always did. But for the first time, a rule had been broken not out of defiance, but out of understanding. And in that quiet shift, something far more powerful than control began to take shape. The night air outside the estate felt different from the silence inside it. It moved. It carried sound, distant traffic, the hum of a city that never truly stopped. Emily stepped off the bus and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. The container of soup held carefully in her hands as she walked the familiar path toward the small building where her mother lived. The streetlights flickered softly above her, casting uneven shadows along the sidewalk. This world was not controlled. It was not perfect, but it was real. When she reached the door, she paused for a moment, steadying her breath, then stepped inside. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paint. A nurse nodded as she passed, recognizing her without needing to speak. Emily pushed open the door to the room and stopped. Her mother lay in bed, her frame smaller than it had been even a week ago, her breathing shallow but steady. The television in the corner played softly, the volume low, filling the room with a background that felt more like comfort than distraction. You came, her mother said, her voice thin but warm. Of course I did. Emily moved closer, setting the container down and adjusting the blanket gently. I always do. Her mother smiled faintly, though her eyes searched Emily's face with quiet understanding. You were late yesterday. Emily hesitated just for a second. Work was busy. The answer was simple, but it was not the truth. Her mother did not press. She never did. Instead, she reached out, her hand resting lightly over Emily's. You're doing too much. Emily shook her head softly. Not enough. The words came out before she could stop them. The weight behind them hung in the air. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. You are enough. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not empty. It was full of something fragile, something that could not exist in the walls of the Blackwood estate. Emily opened the container and began to feed her slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate, each second meaningful. Outside, time moved forward. Inside, it paused. Back at the estate, Adrian Wolfe stood in his study, the clock on the wall marking each passing minute with quiet precision. 10 o'clock, 10:15, 10:30. He told himself he was working, that the reports in front of him required his attention, that the decisions he made tonight would matter by morning. But the numbers blurred. The words lost meaning. His focus was elsewhere. At 10:45, he stood. The movement was sudden, as if something inside him had reached a limit. He walked out of the study, down the hallway, past the staircase, his steps slower now, less controlled. The house was silent, but not the same silence he had known before. This one felt like waiting. He stopped near the window in the main hall, his eyes drifting toward the long driveway beyond the gates. He did not know what he expected to see. He only knew he was looking. Minutes passed. 11 o'clock. 11:15. The clock continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to his thoughts. For years, time had been something he controlled, something he measured, managed, used. Tonight, it moved without him. At 11:30, the faint sound of a car approached the gates. Adrian's gaze sharpened instantly. The headlights cut through the darkness, slow, steady, real. The gate opened. The car moved forward. Emily stepped out moments later, her figure small against the scale of the estate, but unmistakable. She walked toward the entrance with the same quiet focus she carried everywhere, her movements tired but steady. Adrian remained where he was, his presence hidden in the shadows of the hall. He watched as she entered, as she paused briefly near the door, as if adjusting herself before stepping back into the world of rules and silence. She did not know he was there. She did not need to. For the first time, Adrian saw the full distance between her two worlds, the effort it took to move between them, the weight she carried without asking for recognition, without asking for anything at all. And in that moment, something inside him shifted again, not sharply, not dramatically, but deeply, because he realized something he had not allowed himself to see before. She was not just changing the house. She was carrying something far heavier than it. And somehow, without trying, she had begun to carry part of him as well. The next morning did not begin with silence. It began with tension, not loud, not visible to an outsider, but woven into every movement of the house. The staff moved carefully, but now there was something else beneath their precision. Unease. The report had not disappeared. It had not been resolved, and that meant something was coming. Emily entered the dining room as she always did, her posture steady, her focus unchanged, but the weight of the previous night still rested quietly behind her eyes. She had returned before midnight, exactly as instructed. She had followed the rule, but something about the way Adrian had watched her, unseen yet present, lingered in her mind. It had not felt like control. It had felt like something else, something she could not name. Adrian entered moments later. His expression was composed, his movements controlled, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, as if a decision had finally been made. He took his seat, the coffee already waiting, the room settling into its usual silence. But this time, the silence felt like it was waiting for something to break it. Adrian did not begin eating. Instead, he reached for a folder placed beside his plate, the same one the housekeeper had submitted, the same one that carried Emily's name across its pages. He opened it slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself held weight. The staff remained still. The housekeeper stood near the wall, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed forward but alert. Emily stood where she always did, hands lightly clasped, her expression calm. She did not know what he would say, but she was ready to accept it. Adrian read a single page, then closed the folder. The sound was quiet but final. "You violated protocol multiple times." His voice cut cleanly through the room. The words were expected. The tone was not harsh, not raised, just precise. "Yes," Emily answered without hesitation. The housekeeper's shoulders straightened slightly, as if the outcome was already decided. Adrian continued, "You left the property without authorization. You prioritized personal matters over assigned responsibilities." "Yes." Emily did not look away. The pattern was unfolding exactly as it always had. Statement, confirmation, consequence. But then Adrian stopped. His gaze shifted from the folder to her. And something changed. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then he spoke again. "And yet, your performance inside this house has been without fault." The words landed differently. Not accusation, not dismissal, something else. The housekeeper's expression flickered, just for a second. That was not part of the pattern. Adrian leaned back slightly, his eyes still on Emily. "You have not made a single operational error since your arrival." The silence deepened. The staff did not move. Emily remained still, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened. Adrian placed the folder on the table, not pushed aside, not emphasized, just present. The violations are documented. The rules are clear. His voice remained steady. But this house does not run on rules alone. The sentence hung in the air, unfamiliar, almost foreign within these walls. The housekeeper stepped forward slightly. Sir, the protocol requires immediate termination in such cases. Adrian did not look at her. I am aware of the protocol. His tone did not change, but the finality it was unmistakable. The housekeeper stopped. Adrian's gaze remained on Emily. Why did you stay? The question came without warning. It was not about the report, not about the violations. It was about something deeper. Emily held his gaze. Because I had to. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters. The room tightened again, but this time, not with fear. With truth. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. The report remains on file. His voice returned to its controlled tone. But there will be no termination. The words landed with quiet force. The pattern broke completely. The housekeeper's breath caught almost imperceptibly. The staff remained frozen. Emily did not react outwardly, but something inside her shifted. Not relief, not surprise, something deeper. Recognition. Adrian stood, his chair moving back with quiet precision. Effective immediately, your responsibilities remain unchanged. You will continue your duties as assigned. He paused just for a second, then added with a tone that carried more than instruction. And you will inform me before you leave the property. Not a restriction, not a command meant to control. Something else, something closer to acknowledgement. Emily nodded once. Understood. Adrian turned and walked out of the room, his steps steady, his expression unchanged. But behind that control, something irreversible had happened. The rules had not been removed, but they had been rewritten, and for the first time, they included something he had never allowed before. Consideration. The change did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded quietly, the way everything in the Blackwood estate had always done, but this time, it carried warmth instead of control. Days passed, and for the first time since Emily arrived, the house no longer felt like it was resisting her presence. The curtains remained slightly open each morning, no longer questioned. The piano remained silent, but it no longer felt forbidden. And the coffee was no longer just accepted. It was expected. Adrian Wolfe did not speak of the decision he had made in the dining room. He did not explain it, justify it, or revisit it. But his actions began to reveal something far more significant than words ever could. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave with the now familiar container in her hands, she paused at the edge of the kitchen, remembering his instruction. She stepped into the hallway and knocked lightly on the open door of his study. Adrian looked up from his desk, his expression neutral but attentive. "I am leaving to visit my mother," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "What time will you return?" "Before midnight." A brief pause. Then he added, without looking back down at his work, "There is a car available tonight." The words were simple, but they shifted everything. Emily hesitated just for a second. That is not necessary. It is not about necessity. His tone remained calm, but firm in a different way than before. It is about time. She understood what he meant. The bus ride that took 40 minutes each way. The waiting. The exhaustion. The cost that was not written on any bill. Emily nodded once. "Thank you." That night, the car waited at the gate, its engine quiet, its presence understated but undeniable. Emily stepped inside, her movements slower, as if she was still adjusting to something she had not expected. The drive was smooth, uninterrupted, cutting the distance in half. When she arrived, the building looked the same, the hallway unchanged, the faint smell of disinfectant still lingering in the air. But something felt different. Not outside, inside her. When she entered the room, her mother looked up, surprise flickering across her tired face. "You were early." Emily smiled softly as she set the container down. "I had help." Her mother studied her for a moment, then returned the smile, gentle but knowing. You are not alone anymore. The words settled quietly, but they carried truth. Back at the estate, Adrian stood near the window again, his usual position, his usual silence. But tonight, his thoughts were not distant. They were focused, not on numbers, not on decisions that affected markets or companies, on something far smaller and far more important. He had not told anyone about the car. He had not explained it to the staff. He had simply made the decision and allowed it to exist. That was new. For a man who had built his world on structure and control, allowing something to exist without justification was unfamiliar. And yet, it felt right. When Emily returned that night, earlier than usual, she stepped through the door with less weight in her movements. Adrian saw it immediately. Not the time. Not the action. The difference. He did not approach her. He did not speak. But he noticed. And that was enough. The following days continued in that same quiet shift. Small changes. Subtle adjustments. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was learning how to breathe again. And Adrian Wolfe, a man who had spent years avoiding anything that could not be controlled, began to understand something he had long denied. Care was not weakness. It was not risk. It was not loss waiting to happen. It was something else. Something that could rebuild what had been broken piece by piece without demanding anything in return. And Emily, without ever asking for it, without ever expecting it, had become the one person who showed him how. The final change did not come with an announcement. It arrived quietly, the way everything meaningful in the Blackwood estate now seemed to happen. Weeks had passed, and the house no longer felt like a place built to keep life out. The curtains were open more often than they were closed. The piano, though still rarely touched, no longer felt like a forbidden object. And the silence, once heavy and suffocating, had softened into something calmer, something that allowed space instead of taking it. Emily moved through the house, as she always had, steady and composed, but now there was something different in the way the staff looked at her. Not suspicion, not distance, respect. The housekeeper, once rigid and distant, now spoke with a quieter tone. The chef no longer avoided her gaze. The house had adapted, not because it was forced to, but because it had witnessed something it could not deny. That morning, Emily prepared the dining room, as usual, placing the coffee at the far end of the table, just as Adrian preferred. But today, there was something else waiting on the table. A small envelope, placed carefully beside the cup. She paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on it, then stepped back as Adrian entered the room. His presence was the same, controlled, composed, but no longer distant. He took his seat, his gaze moving briefly to the envelope, then to Emily. Open it. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Emily stepped forward slowly and picked up the envelope. Inside was a document. Official. Detailed. She read the first line, and her breath caught before she could stop it. Full coverage for advanced cardiac treatment. Approved and secured. The hospital name was one she recognized immediately. The best in the state. Her eyes lifted, searching his face, trying to understand. This is not charity, Adrian said, his voice steady, but quieter than it had ever been before. It is an investment. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. I do not understand. He held her gaze, not with distance, but with clarity. You stayed when everyone else left. You worked without fault, and you cared for someone without asking for anything in return. He paused, just for a moment, then added, his voice softer now. That has value. The room was silent, but it was no longer empty. It was full of something real, something that had taken time to build. Emily looked down at the document again, the weight of it settling in slowly. This changes everything. Adrian nodded once. It should. A quiet breath left her, and for the first time since she arrived, her composure wavered. Not into weakness, into relief. Thank you. The words were simple, but they carried everything she could not say. Adrian did not respond immediately. He watched her, not as someone who needed to be managed or controlled, but as someone he finally understood. Then he spoke, his voice steady, but no longer distant. You rebuilt more than this house. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his. You rebuilt me. The words settled between them. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true. And in that truth, something permanent took shape. Later that day, Emily stood once again beside her mother's bed, the document now resting in her hands. Her mother read it slowly, her eyes filling with quiet emotion. You did this. Emily shook her head gently. No, we did. Because for the first time, she was not carrying everything alone. Back at the estate, the windows remained open, the light filling the spaces that had once been closed off. And Adrian Wolfe, a man who had once believed that shutting the world out was the only way to survive it, stood in that light without turning away. Because he had learned something he would never forget. That the strongest thing a person could build was not control. It was connection. And sometimes, all it took to rebuild a broken heart was one person who refused to give up on it.